One of the strangest things about all the modern shooters these days is how the developers looked at Doom in 2016 and the follow-up Doom Eternal, saw two of the best first-person shooters like ever made, and somehow walked away with the complete wrong lessons. For every game that understands why those titles worked, there are 10 others that copy the surface level elements. They add dashes, they add glory kill equivalents, they add all the arena combat and double jumps and wall running they can, but they miss the actual point. They forgot what made Doom special wasn't any one of these individual mechanics. It was just how every system fed into each other to create a combat loop that constantly demanded your attention. Metal Eden is one of the few games I've played recently that seems to understand this. Developed by Raycon Games, the team behind Ruiner, Metal Eden is a fast paced cyberpunk shooter that wears its influences so openly that there are moments where it almost feels uncomfortable. There are several times throughout my playthrough where I found myself thinking, okay, all right, what are we like? This is just Doom Eternal here. Like, it is a Doom clone. And yet, for most of it, I could not stop having fun. Because while Metal Eden rarely reinvents the wheel, it understands something many games don't, and sometimes execution matters way more than originality. The result is a shooter that is incredibly easy to recommend if you're the kind of person who lives for those modern movement shooters, but it's also a game that feels frustratingly incomplete. The foundations are excellent, the combat is excellent, and the movement is excellent. The problem is when this game just starts to hit its stride, it's over. All right, let's get the story out of the way first, because frankly, I don't think it's a reason anybody's going to play Metal Eden, because it's not really there. The game takes place in a futuristic society where human consciousness can be stored within these machine cores. It's classic cyberpunk territory. Questions about identity, humanity, consciousness, and technology are all floating around in the background. The ingredients for an interesting story are technically here. The game really never knows what to do with them. If I'm being completely honest, by the time I got to the end of the game and the credits rolled, I wasn't entirely sure I could even explain the plot to someone else with complete confidence. I followed the broad strokes. I understand the objectives, but so much of the narrative is delivered through lengthy conversations between your protagonist and your AI companion, while so much is already happening on screen, that eventually my brain just starts tuning parts of it out. And that's partly because the protagonist herself, she also feels more like a vehicle for gameplay than an actual established character. It feels like the developers were aiming for the same archetype that made characters like Doomslayer or Master Chief so effective. The quiet, stoic warrior who lets their actions do all of the talking. The problem is that those characters work because worlds around them are interesting. Everything going on around these guys are interesting. They're supported by memorable side characters, the compelling lore, the stories that continue moving even when your protagonist isn't speaking. Metal Eden doesn't really have that luxury, unfortunately. As a result, the narrative often feels less like a central pillar of the experience and more like something happening in the background while you wait for your next combat arena to open. Thankfully, that's where the game really does start to fire on all cylinders. The moment Metal Eden stops talking and starts throwing enemies at you, everything sort of then begins to click into place. Because whatever shortcomings I have with the story, and we'll get to some of the game's other issues later, there is absolutely no denying that Raycon Games understands how to make combat feel good. Not realistic, not tactical in the slightest, good. There's a difference. A lot of modern shooters have become obsessed with precision, and they want every bullet to matter, every reload animation to feel grounded, every encounter to feel like a military simulation. Metal Eden, I'm happy to report, could not care less about any of that. This is a game that wants you moving constantly. Standing still, even for a few seconds, feels fundamentally wrong, like you're doing something wrong. The arenas are designed around your momentum, your aggression, and maintaining a flow state where you're constantly making decisions at super high speed. And honestly, that is where the Doom Eternal comparisons become unavoidable. Much like Doom Eternal, ammunition is intentionally limited. You aren't meant to sit back and slowly whittle enemies down from a safe distance. The game's actively discouraging your passive play. Instead, it constantly pushes you into the middle of a fight where all the systems begin feeding into one another. At the center of all this is the game's core system, which is probably easily Metal Eden's best idea. Every enemy is protected by armor, and once the armor's been destroyed, either through gunfight or melee attacks, you gain the ability to rip out an enemy's core directly from their chest. Doing so will instantly kill them, but it also presents you with a very interesting choice. You can throw the core like a grenade, damaging nearby enemies and forcing them to drop more armor and ammunition, or you can consume it. And this is where things start to get a little bit interesting. Consuming a core will restore your health depending on what upgrades, grant you additional armor, bonus damage, increase your movement speed, and a whole bunch of other buffs. More importantly, it also powers up your melee attack, transforming it into like a devastating armor shattering punch. What I appreciate most about this mechanic is that it creates a constant need for micro decisions. Do I need the ammunition? I should throw the core. Do I want health? Maybe I should consume it. I need to quickly strip armor from a larger target, consume it, and empower my punch. None of these decisions are particularly complex individually, but when you're making dozens of them every minute while dashing around an arena filled with enemies, the combat develops a rhythm that feels incredibly satisfying. One of my favorite moments throughout the game came when I found myself just desperately low on health. And instead of retreating, which most shooters would encourage, Metal Eden rewarded me for doing the exact opposite. I charged directly towards an enemy, punched through its armor, ripped out its core, consumed it, regained my health, and immediately launched myself into another target. That's Metal Eden in a nutshell. Aggression isn't just encouraged, it's all a part of your survival, and that's why combat works so well. Every mechanic feeds into every other mechanic. Health restoration encourages aggression. Aggression generates resources. Resources enable stronger attacks, and stronger attacks create more opportunities for aggression. It's a beautifully constructed loop, and it just feels so good once you figure it out. Is it original? No, not entirely. Anybody who's spent any significant time with Doom Eternal will immediately recognize many of the ideas have been borrowed here. There were multiple occasions where I found myself noticing little similarities that felt almost impossible to ignore, making the game feel more like a Doom light, if you will. But imitation isn't inherently a bad thing. The reality is that very few games have successfully captured what makes Doom Eternal's combat so compelling, and Metal Eden gets closer than most. The result is a shooter that remains consistently engaging from beginning to end, even when some of the other systems fail to leave the same lasting impression. One of the easiest mistakes a movement shooter can make is filling its arsenal with weapons that technically function differently, but ultimately accomplish the same thing. You know the type. One rifle shoots slightly faster, another does slightly more damage, and the third has a scope on it. On paper, they're different weapons. In practice, they're all accomplishing the exact same task. Thankfully, though, Metal Eden avoids this trap. Whilst the game's arsenal isn't particularly revolutionary, each weapon feels like it serves a distinct role within the border combat sandbox. More importantly, every weapon feels good to use, which is something that sounds obvious until you play enough shooters to realize how uncommon that actually is. You begin with an infinite ammo submachine gun that relies on an overheating mechanic rather than the traditional ammunition reserves. It's a sensible starting weapon and serves its purpose well during the opening hours. Unfortunately, it also highlights one of the few balancing issues I had with the game's arsenal. The overheat threshold feels far too restrictive. Yes, you can improve it through upgrades. Yes, there were ways to make it more effective, but I feel that once the game started handing out more specialized weapons, I rarely felt any reason to return to the default SMG. It becomes less of a reliable fallback weapon and more of something you will occasionally remember exists, which happens with some of the other guns, but thankfully, most of the arsenal does pick up that slack. The shotgun is exactly what you want it to be: loud, violent, immensely satisfying. The energy rifle quickly becomes one of my favorite tools because of how effectively it strips armor from enemies. The heavy explosive weapons excel at crowd control, and some of the later game equipment can absolutely devastate entire groups if used correctly. What impressed me most wasn't necessarily the individual weapons themselves, it's how naturally they fit into the game's combat loop. Because you're never using a weapon simply because it's the stronger option, you're using it because it's the correct option for the situation that you're currently facing. Strip armor with one weapon, finish enemy with another, rip a core, restore resources, repeat. The constant cycling between tools help maintain the momentum that makes the combat so enjoyable in the first place. The upgrade system also follows a similar philosophy. Throughout the campaign, you'll earn currency that can be spent unlocking alternate firing modes, additional weapon functionality, and some of these upgrades are genuinely excellent. Others feel considerably less useful. The energy rifle's charge blast, for example, becomes a staple of my loadout almost immediately. Other upgrades feel so situational that I frequently forget they exist. Good news is, Metal Eden never overwhelms players with unnecessary complexity. it becomes fairly obvious which upgrades complement your preferred playstyle and which ones can safely be ignored. The character progression system is arguably more successful. Rather than simply increasing damage numbers, many upgrades fundamentally alter how you approach encounters. You can reduce cooldowns, improve survivability, strengthen buffs gained from consumed cores, increase mobile options, and generally tailor the experience towards your preferred style of play. On normal difficulty, you can get away with a lot of mistakes. The game's generous healing opportunities make survival relatively forgiving. But the harder difficulties, these upgrades become significantly more meaningful. Suddenly, every cooldown matters, every resource matters, and every decision matters. And that's where Metal Eden starts showing glimpses of much deeper combat systems than it initially appears to possess, and why all the gameplay you're seeing in this review is done on the brutal difficulty, the hardest difficulty in the game. If combat is the heart of Metal Eden, movement is the bloodstream pumping life through the entire experience. Here's the thing. You can have the best weapon in the world. You can have fantastic enemy design. You can have incredible visual effects and satisfying explosions. But if moving around that environment doesn't feel good, a movement shooter falls on its face almost immediately. Thankfully, though, Metal Eden understood this. Wall running feels smooth, dashing feels responsive, double jumping feels intuitive. Traversal genuinely flows in a way that makes navigating the world enjoyable, even when enemies aren't actively shooting at you. There's a fluidity to everything that keeps the game moving forward in a very impressive pace. You rarely spend long periods wandering around trying to figure out where to go next. The game always seems eager to push you towards the next combat encounter, the next platforming section, or the next big set piece. And for the most part, that works. The problem is that eventually you start noticing how repetitive the journey between these encounters becomes. Most levels follow a remarkably similar structure. Run through corridor, complete a platforming section, enter an arena, fight several waves of enemies, repeat, repeat, repeat. To be fair, repetition isn't inherently a problem. Every shooter relies on some degree of repetition. The issue is that Metal Eden doesn't do enough to disguise it. After several hours, many of the environments start blending together. Futuristic industrial complexes dominate the visual landscape, and while they're technically impressive from a graphical standpoint, they rarely leave a lasting impression. There are multiple points throughout my playthrough where I found myself appreciating the visual fidelity, while simultaneously struggling to remember where one level ended and the next began. A strong sense of environmental variety would have gone a long way towards making the campaign feel a lot larger than it actually is. The most obvious attempt to address this comes in the form of the ball traversal sections on Vulcan. And honestly, yeah, they're fine. It's probably the best way I can describe them. For a couple of levels, Metal Eden allows you to transform into a high-speed ball, kind of like a la Metroid, capable of boosting through terrain and attacking enemies in different ways. These sections are enjoyable enough and provide a welcome break from the standard formula. The issue is they feel oddly disconnected from the rest of the game as a whole. They're introduced, used briefly, then largely abandoned. Rather than feeling like a natural extension of the game's mechanics, they come across as experimental ideas that never received enough development time to become fully realized features in the game. It's almost as if the developers recognized the risk of a campaign becoming visually repetitive and attempted to inject variety wherever they could. Don't get me wrong, the effort is appreciated, but the execution, it just feels incomplete. Fortunately, the boss fights fare somewhat better. While I wouldn't call any of them particularly memorable, they generally succeed at testing the skills you develop throughout your time in the campaign. They demand mastery of movement, resource management, and positioning without ever really feeling unfair. They are solid encounters. I just wish more of them had left a lasting impression. Now, we arrive at the part of the review that frustrates me most. Because everything I've talked about so far, the combat, the movement, the progression system, the weapons, it works. Not perfectly, but well enough that I find myself genuinely invested in mastering them. And that's exactly what Metal Eden, and that's exactly why Metal Eden's biggest flaw hurts as much as it does. The game is over before it feels like it should be. I finished my first playthrough in roughly 5 hours, which isn't itself necessarily a criticism. I've seen plenty of people dismiss games simply because they're short, and I think that's a lazy criticism. I think even the shortest of games can have something to say and bring something to the table, and this is definitely one of them. A game's value shouldn't be determined by how long it takes to finish. I'd rather play a phenomenal 6-hour campaign than a mediocre 55-hour one. The problem isn't that Metal Eden is short, The problem is Metal Eden spends almost the entirety of its runtime teaching you how to play. Like, think about it. The first few hours are dedicated to introducing mechanics, unlocking abilities, expanding your arsenal, and gradually teaching players how to get all these systems to interact. New weapons continue arriving well into the campaign, new upgrades continue to become available, new combat possibilities continue to open up. And then the credits roll. It's a bizarre feeling because by the final mission, I felt like I was finally starting to understand everything the game wanted from me, how the flow worked, and how it all went together. I understood the combat rhythm. I understood the resource management. I understood the upgrades that suited my playstyle. I finally understood which weapons complemented one another. I was finally playing Metal Eden the way I suspected the developers intended. And then the game ended. It's the equivalent of spending an entire term learning how to use a tool, only to have somebody take it away from you the moment you became proficient with it. What makes this even more frustrating is how obvious the solution seems. Just give me and players more ways to engage with the systems you built. That's it. That's the answer. Because once the campaign concludes, there's very little reason to stick around. Now, technically, there is a New Game Plus and there is the Gauntlet mode, but they weren't there at launch, and both suffer from the same underlying problem. They don't fundamentally change the experience enough. You're essentially replaying content you've already completed, only with slightly different numbers attached. And maybe that's enough for some players. And if it is, that's great. But when a combat system is this enjoyable and I can't help feeling like there was a huge missed opportunity here, like, where are the challenge arenas? You know what I mean? Where are combat trials? Where's an escalating survival mode? Where are encounters specifically designed around a fully upgraded character? Where are some score attacks, some daily challenges, an endless mode? Anything like that. Because the foundation for all those ideas, it already exists. That's the frustrating part. If Metal Eden's combat wasn't enjoyable, none of this would matter. Nobody asks for more content in a game they don't enjoy playing. The reason this criticism exists at all is because the gameplay is strong enough that I wanted excuses to keep engaging with it. Instead, the game simply shrugs and says, well, that's all we've got. Have a good day. And maybe that was acceptable maybe like 10, 15 years ago, but today it feels like a whole missed opportunity. It's a strange trend in modern shooters. Developers spend years building sophisticated combat systems, progression mechanics, and movement tools, only to provide players with the bare minimum amount of content necessary to experience them. The best equivalent I can give it is, imagine if Doom Eternal had ended halfway through the campaign. Imagine you've just unlocked the super shotgun and the credits roll 20 to 30 minutes later. It's obviously an exaggeration, but it captures the feeling I had throughout Metal Eden's final act. The game reaches a point where everything is firing on all cylinders, and then it stops. And that's incredibly disappointing. Not because it's bad, but because it was good enough to make me wish there was significantly more of it. Metal Eden is one of those games that's simultaneously easy to recommend, but frustrating to talk about. Easy to recommend because the moment-to-moment gameplay is genuinely excellent. The game that clearly understands what makes movement shooters fun. The combat is aggressive, rewarding, and consistently satisfying. The core systems just add enough strategic decision-making to distinguish itself from some of its influences. The weapons, they feel powerful. The movement, incredibly responsive. The progression system encourages experimentation. And most importantly, I was having fun almost the entire time. And honestly, I think taking everything into account, that's worth a lot. Especially in an era where so many games seem more interested in retaining your attention and your money than actually entertaining you. Metal Eden never had that problem. From the opening moment to the closing credits, it remains consistently engaging. The issue is it just never evolved beyond being engaging. The story never becomes compelling. The world never becomes particularly memorable. The environments never become visually diverse enough to stand out from one another, and the game never fully escapes the shadow cast by Doom Eternal and Doom 2016. There were countless moments where I found myself appreciating what Metal Eden was doing while simultaneously recognizing where those ideas originated. To the game's credit, however, imitation only becomes a problem when execution fails. And for the most part, execution here 100% succeeds. Raycon Games has created a genuinely fun shooter. A very good one, in fact. It's just a shooter that feels like the first half of something great. Maybe future updates will address some of the shortcomings. Maybe a sequel will address some shortcomings. Maybe we might get modes again soon. I don't know. Maybe just start working on that sequel, you know? Maybe the developer already has plans to expand the experience way beyond what we currently have. And I certainly hope so, because beneath the somewhat forgettable story, the environment, the limited amount of content, lies probably one of the most satisfying FPS combat systems I've played since my time with Doom Eternal. Metal Eden doesn't reinvent the movement shooter, it doesn't revolutionize the genre, and it doesn't rise to challenge Doom Eternal, the Dark Ages, or 2016 for the crown. But it doesn't need to. What it does is deliver 5 or 6 hours of fast, violent, wonderfully chaotic action that consistently reminds you why this style of shooter became so popular in the first place. The only real tragedy is, just when Metal Eden convinces you it deserves a place alongside the genre's modern greats, it's already over. So yeah, that's where I'm really at with Metal Eden. I think if you're someone who has PlayStation Plus, it's on the PlayStation Plus catalog. Definitely jump in and try it. I think it's a lot of fun. That's where I'm at. I think it's a definite recommend. I think if you're a big fan of the Doom Eternal, Doom 2016, the movement system, the movement shooter, and everything that's good about it, definitely jump in to Metal Eden. Just don't go in expecting a 10 out of 10 story or anything of real substance guiding you through these encounters. It's more of a jump in and have fun playing. Don't jump in and expect anything beyond that. It's a definite recommend, but yeah, if you're a story person, it may be worth checking something else out. But that is going to do it for me, guys. Thank you so much for watching the review. I know it's a longer one. Like I said, I'm going to try more video essay style reviews, so be sure to let me know what you guys thought of this one down in the comments below and what I can do to improve in the future. I'd very much appreciate it. But thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. I love you all, and I will catch you guys in the next video. Bye, everybody.